The highway stretched before me like a ribbon of worn asphalt, cutting through Georgia's humid landscape, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like old curtains. I had driven this route a dozen times as a kid, pressed against the backseat window while Dad lectured about discipline and Mom hummed gospel songs under her breath. Now, at 29, I was making the journey alone in my beat-up Honda Civic, the air conditioning wheezing against July's oppressive heat. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Another group text from Mom, "Rehearsal dinner at 7. Please dress appropriately. Love you." The gentle reminder stung more than it should have. Even in her kindness, there was an assumption that I'd somehow messed this up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I pulled over at a gas station just outside Savannah, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like it's been brewing since the Clinton administration. Through the smudged windows, I could see the city's skyline emerging through the heat haze, church spires and historic facades that looked like postcards tourists never sent home. This place held too many memories, most of them involving me standing in Caleb's shadow while Dad beamed with pride at his younger son's latest achievement. The GPS directed me past Forsyth Park, where I'd once tried to impress a girl by reading her Neruda under the fountain. She'd laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of pity reserved for earnest young men who thought poetry could bridge the gap between wanting and being wanted. I wondered if she still lived here, if she'd married someone practical like Caleb, someone who understood that love was best expressed through mortgage payments and retirement plans. I found myself driving past Riverside High, the brick building where I'd taught for 3 years before the budget cuts. The parking lot was empty now, summer vacation holding the place in suspended animation. Through the chain-link fence, I could see room 237, where I'd spent countless afternoons helping kids discover that Shakespeare wasn't their enemy, and that their own stories mattered just as much as anything in the canon. Mrs. Henderson had cried when I left, pressing a card into my hand signed by 47 students. I still kept it in my wallet, creased and fading. The bookstore on Bull Street was still there, thank God. I ducked inside, grateful for the air conditioning and the familiar smell of old paper. The owner, a woman with silver hair and paint-stained fingers, helped me find a first edition of Mary Oliver's American Primitive. Caleb wouldn't understand the gift. He'd probably shelve it next to his real estate manuals, but it felt important to give him something that mattered to me. As I walked back to my car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestones, I rehearsed what I might say to Dad. "Good to see you." Too formal. "Hey, Pops." Too casual. "I'm sorry I'm not the son you wanted." Too honest. Instead, I'd probably just smile and nod, the way I always did, and hope that this time would be different. The Magnolia Estate rose from the riverbank like something out of Gone with the Wind, all white columns and manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than I made in a year. Valets in crisp white shirts directed luxury cars toward the circular drive, where guests emerged in designer suits and cocktail dresses that whispered money with every rustle of fabric. I parked my Honda between a BMW and a Mercedes, feeling like a sparrow that had wandered into a peacock convention. Through my rearview mirror, I watched a woman in pearls, the size of grapes, step delicately around my car, as if poverty might be contagious. The rehearsal dinner was being held in the estate's grand ballroom, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across parquet floors that reflected like still water. I spotted Caleb immediately. He had that gravitational pull successful people develop, drawing conversations and laughter into his orbit. His tailored navy suit probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he wore it with the ease of someone who'd never questioned whether he belonged in expensive places. "Eli," Marianne appeared beside me, elegant in a way that seemed effortless but probably required considerable planning. Her handshake was firm, professional, the kind politician's perfect. "So wonderful to finally meet Caleb's brother. Are you in real estate too?" "I'm a teacher," I said, and watched her expression shift slightly, the way people's faces change when they realize you're not going to be useful to them. How meaningful, she said, already scanning the room for more important conversations. Please, help yourself to the bar. The bourbon selection is supposed to be exceptional. Quote, I made my way through clusters of guests who spoke in the easy cadences of inherited wealth, their conversations peppered with references to country clubs and vacation homes in places I'd only seen in magazines. Someone mentioned a little place in the Hamptons, with the casual tone most people reserve for talking about their garage. Caleb found me by the Shrimp Tower, looking nervous in a way I hadn't seen since high school. You made it, he said, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a business transaction. You look, he paused, taking in my off-the-rack blazer and thrift store tie. You look good, man, really good. The lie hung between us like smoke. We both knew I looked exactly like what I was. A small-town teacher trying to blend in at a party where the appetizers cost more than my car payment. Marianne's family is excited to meet you, he continued, his voice carrying that forced enthusiasm people use when they're trying to convince themselves of something. Her dad owns half the commercial real estate in Atlanta. Really impressive guy. I nodded, watching him work the room with practiced charm, shaking hands and remembering names with the skill of a natural politician. This was Caleb's element. He moved through wealth like a fish through water, never questioning his right to be there. When Dad appeared across the room in his dress blues, metals catching the light, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. He surveyed the gathering with military precision, and when his eyes found mine, his smile faltered just enough to remind me why I'd stayed away so long. Dinner was served on bone china that probably had its own insurance policy. I found myself seated at the family table, sandwiched between Mom and an elderly woman who kept asking if I was in finance like Caleb. Each time I explained I was a teacher, she nodded politely and immediately forgot, as if my profession was too insignificant to register. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, talk of market trends, investment portfolios, and vacation properties. I picked at my salmon and tried to disappear into the upholstery, but escape became impossible when the clinking of crystal called for attention. Dad stood slowly, his posture military straight, even in civilian clothes. The room fell silent with the respect accorded to decorated veterans, though I suspected the reverence had more to do with the size of Marianne's father's donations to veteran charities. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across the ballroom with parade ground authority. Tonight we celebrate not just the union of two families, but the success of a young man who understood what it takes to build a life worth living. Applause rippled through the crowd as Dad's gaze found Caleb, his expression soft with pride I'd never seen directed at me. Caleb Jennings, he continued, has shown the kind of drive and ambition that makes a father proud. Real estate empire at 27, beautiful fiancée from a distinguished family, a future as bright as Georgia's sunshine. He raised his glass higher. Success isn't given. It's earned through discipline, focus, and the wisdom to choose paths that lead somewhere meaningful. The words hung in the air like humidity, thick and oppressive. I knew what was coming before he turned to me, could feel it in the way Mom's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently in preparation for the blow. Now I have 2 sons, Dad said, his smile taking on a sharp edge, and I've learned that not every boy has the same fire burning inside him. Some are destined for greatness, and others... He paused, letting his gaze settle on me like a weight. Others take their time finding their way. Some never do, but that's okay. The world needs followers, too. Laughter scattered across the room like broken glass. Not cruel laughter, exactly, but the uncomfortable kind that fills awkward silences when someone crosses a line everyone recognizes but nobody wants to acknowledge. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, that familiar burning shame that had followed me since childhood whenever Dad decided to use my life as a cautionary tale. Here's to Caleb, he finished, his glass held high, the son who understood that dreams without action are just pretty thoughts. The toast echoed through the ballroom, to Caleb, while I sat frozen in my chair feeling like I was drowning in plain sight. Mom's grip on my hand tightened, but her smile never wavered, decades of practice keeping her expression neutral while her heart broke for her firstborn. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against hardwood like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Excuse me," I murmured, heading for the French doors that led to the garden, desperate for air that didn't taste like humiliation. The garden air felt like salvation after the suffocating atmosphere inside. Ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss created a canopy of shadows, and somewhere in the distance, the Savannah River whispered against its banks. I found myself beneath a massive magnolia tree, its waxy white blooms glowing like ghosts in the moonlight. I was fumbling for my car keys, ready to drive back to my motel and pretend this evening had never happened, when a voice called out behind me, "Mr. Jennings." I turned to find a young man in clerical collar approaching, his face earnest and somehow familiar. He was maybe 25, with kind eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to carry other people's pain. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" I asked, though something in his expression suggested we did. "Thomas Avery," he said, extending his hand. "But you knew me as Tommy. Tommy Avery, 4th period English, Riverside High, 2018. The name hit me like a wave. Tommy. Quiet, brilliant Tommy, who'd sat in the back corner and written poetry that made my chest ache with its raw honesty. Tommy, who'd missed 3 weeks that spring and come back hollow-eyed, moving through my classroom like a ghost. Tommy, I breathed, and suddenly I could see the boy he'd been beneath the man he'd become. "My God, you're the priest? You're officiating tomorrow?" He nodded, his smile uncertain. "Marianne's family hired me through the diocese. They wanted someone young, fresh out of seminary." He paused, studying my face. "I had no idea you'd be here. I mean, I knew Caleb's last name was Jennings, but I never connected. Mr. Jennings, I've been looking for you for years." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The words hung between us like a confession. In the distance, I could hear laughter spilling from the ballroom, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations that had already moved past my father's casual cruelty. "Tommy, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there when he was 17. "Mr. Jennings, do you remember that afternoon in April when you kept me after class? When you read me that poem, 'Even Quiet Hands Hold the Sky'?" I remembered. He'd been failing everything that semester, turning in assignments covered in angry scribbles, if he turned them in at all. His parents were divorcing, messily and publicly, and he'd started wearing long sleeves, even in the Georgia heat. That day, something in his eyes had terrified me. "I remember," I said softly. "I was going to kill myself that night." The words came out flat, matter of fact. I had it all planned out. Pills from my mom's medicine cabinet, note written, everything ready. "But you kept me after class, and you read me that poem about invisible hands holding up the world, about how every quiet act of love matters, even when nobody sees it." My throat tightened. I'd never known, never suspected how close I'd come to losing one of my students. "You told me that my words mattered, that my story wasn't finished. You said that sometimes the people who feel everything the deepest are the ones the world needs most." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "Mr. Jennings, I wouldn't be here without you. I wouldn't be alive without you." I sat in my motel room later that night, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere I'd never been. The conversation with Tommy had left me feeling raw, exposed, like a nerve touched by cold air. My phone buzzed with missed calls from Mom, but I couldn't face her gentle concern, her careful questions that never quite asked what she really wanted to know. A knock at the door interrupted my brooding. Through the peephole, I saw Caleb standing under the flickering fluorescent light, still wearing his dinner jacket, but with his bow tie hanging loose around his neck like a noose he'd partially escaped. "Eli, come on. I know you're in there." I opened the door and found my little brother looking older than his 27 years, stress carved into the lines around his eyes. He held a bottle of bourbon and 2 plastic cups from the motel ice machine. "Figured you might need a drink," he said, pushing past me into the room. "Hell, I know I do." He poured 2 generous shots and handed me one, then sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the cheap mattress creaking under his weight. For a moment, we drank in silence, the bourbon burning away the pretense that had built up between us over the years. Dad was out of line tonight, he finally said, though his voice lacked conviction. Was he? I set down my cup harder than necessary. Or was he just saying what everyone in that room was thinking? Poor Eli, the disappointment, the one who couldn't figure out how to matter. That's not. It is, though. I turned to face him fully. Caleb, when he was tearing me down in front of your future in-laws, where were you? When he was using my life as a punchline for a room full of strangers, why didn't you say anything? Caleb's jaw worked silently, and for a moment I saw the boy he'd been, the one who used to hide behind me during Dad's tirades, who'd beg me to read him stories when the yelling got too loud downstairs. This weekend is important, Eli. Marianne's family, they have expectations, standards. I can't afford to. To what? To defend your brother? The words came out sharper than I intended. To suggest that maybe there's more than one way to build a life worth living? You don't understand the pressure I'm under. He refilled his cup with shaking hands. Do you know what it's like being the golden child? Do you think it's easy carrying Dad's dreams on my shoulders every goddamn day? At least he has dreams for you. I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the motel's empty parking lot. Do you know what it's like watching your father look through you like you're glass? Like your life is so insignificant it doesn't even register as a disappointment anymore. Eli, I just wanted peace tonight. Just wanted to celebrate your wedding without having to defend my existence. I turned back to him. But you couldn't even give me that. You sat there and let him humiliate me because it was easier than risking your perfect image. Caleb set down his cup and stood, straightening his jacket like armor. You think this is easy for me? You think I enjoy watching Dad tear you apart? But what am I supposed to do, Eli? Start a fight at my own rehearsal dinner? You're supposed to be my brother, I said quietly. You're supposed to remember that we used to protect each other. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Caleb moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. Peace without truth is just silence, I said to his back. He left without another word, taking the bourbon with him. The morning sun filtered through stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, casting rainbow patterns across mahogany pews filled with Savannah's finest. I'd almost left, had my bags packed and the car keys in my hand, but something Tommy had said kept pulling me back. Maybe it was the weight of knowing I'd saved a life without even realizing it. Maybe it was stubbornness. I slipped into a back pew, just as the processional began, trying to make myself invisible among the sea of pastels and pearls. Marianne's bridesmaids floated down the aisle like southern belles painted by Monet, all silk and practiced smiles. The chapel hummed with whispered compliments about flower arrangements that probably cost more than most people's cars. When Marianne appeared in the doorway, a collective sigh rose from the congregation. She was radiant in the way expensive weddings demand, her dress a cascade of imported lace, her veil trailing behind her like captured sunlight. This was the kind of moment that would grace the society pages, the kind of perfection money could buy and breeding could polish. Caleb stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking every inch the successful young man our father had always wanted him to be. His smile was camera-ready, but I caught the nervous tick in his left hand, the one he'd had since childhood whenever Dad's expectations felt too heavy. Reverend Tommy Avery stepped forward to begin the ceremony, and something in his posture made me sit straighter. He looked different from the night before, more confident, purposeful, like someone who'd found his calling and wasn't afraid to use it. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel. We gather today to witness the union of Caleb and Marianne, but before we speak of their love, I feel called to share something that happened to me many years ago. A murmur rippled through the congregation. This wasn't in the program. Marianne's mother shifted uncomfortably in the front pew. When I was 17, I was drowning, Tommy continued, his eyes finding mine in the back of the chapel. Not in water, but in despair so deep, I couldn't see the surface anymore. I had given up on life, on hope, on the possibility that tomorrow could be different from today. The chapel fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on Bull Street. Even the organist seemed to hold her breath. "But there was a teacher," Tommy said, his voice growing stronger. "A man who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, who kept me after class one April afternoon and read me a poem about invisible hands holding up the sky, who reminded me that every quiet act of love matters, even when nobody sees it." My throat tightened as I realized what he was about to do. "That teacher," Tommy continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel, "saved my life with nothing more than patience and poetry. His name is Eli Jennings, and he's sitting right there in the back." Quote, "Every head turned toward me like sunflowers following light. I felt exposed, pinned like a butterfly under glass, as 200 pairs of eyes found me in my ill-fitting suit." Marianne's father looked confused. Her mother appeared scandalized that the ceremony had been hijacked by unscripted emotion. "Mr. Jennings," Tommy called out, "would you please stand?" My legs felt like water, but somehow I rose. The chapel was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of all those stairs pressing against my chest like hands. "I know this isn't traditional," Tommy said, addressing the congregation but keeping his eyes on me, "but before we celebrate the love between Caleb and Marianne, I wanted to honor the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. The love of a teacher who sees potential in broken teenagers. The love that shows up every day, invisible and uncelebrated, building futures one student at a time." Someone, I think it was Mom, started crying quietly in the front row. Dad sat rigid as stone, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Sir," Tommy said directly to me, "would you be willing to share a few words? I think these people need to hear from someone who understands what it means to live a life of purpose rather than praise." The request hung in the air like incense. I could have declined, could have sat back down, and let the moment pass, but something in Tommy's eyes, the same desperate hope I'd seen in that 17-year-old boy, gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I cleared my throat, my voice barely audible at first. "I never wanted to be celebrated," I began, then stronger. "I just wanted to be remembered. Not for what I accumulated, but for what I gave away." The words came from somewhere deep, bypassing my brain entirely. There's a poem by Mary Oliver that says we must ask ourselves, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I chose to spend mine in classrooms that smell like chalk dust and teenage dreams. I chose to believe that the kid in the back row who never speaks might have something extraordinary to say if someone just listens. I found Dad's face in the crowd, his expression unreadable. I didn't succeed the way my father wanted me to succeed. I don't own houses or cars that impress strangers. But I showed up. Every day, I showed up for kids who needed someone to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. My voice broke slightly. "If that makes me unsuccessful, then I'll wear that failure like a badge of honor." The silence that followed felt sacred, pregnant with possibility. Dad stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor like a gunshot in the sacred silence. Without a word, he turned and walked down the aisle, his military bearing intact even in retreat. The heavy chapel doors closed behind him, with a finality that echoed through the stunned congregation. I found him 20 minutes later by the reflecting pool in the chapel gardens, smoking a cigarette with the desperate intensity of a man trying to burn away uncomfortable truths. He'd removed his jacket. His dress shirt wilted in the Georgia heat. "You embarrassed this family in there," he said without turning around, smoke curling from his lips, like prayers he'd never learned to say. "You embarrassed me my whole life," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I just didn't have a microphone before." He turned then, his face carved from granite and disappointment. "Everything I did was to make you boys stronger, to prepare you for a world that doesn't give a damn about your feelings." "No, Dad, everything you did was to make us into versions of yourself. And when I couldn't fit that mold, you decided I was broken." You chose a life with no security, no respect, no future. I chose a life with meaning. The words came out harder than I intended. I chose to matter to people who needed me to matter. How is that failure? He took another drag, his hands shaking slightly. For the first time, I noticed how he'd aged, the gray threading through his hair, the lines etched deep around his eyes. He looked tired, worn down by decades of carrying expectations that never quite fit. I wanted you to survive, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I grew up dirt poor, Eli. Beans and cornbread poor. I swore my sons would never know that kind of struggle. I never wanted your money, Dad. I never wanted your pride. I stepped closer, close enough to see the tears he was fighting. I just wanted your respect. I wanted you to see that I was trying, even if I was trying at something different. You think I don't see? His voice cracked like old leather. You think I don't know what you've done? That boy in there, that priest, he's not the first student who's written me letters about you. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Then, why? I asked. Why do you keep cutting me down? He dropped his cigarette, crushing it under his heel. Because I'm a stubborn old fool who doesn't know how to say he's proud of a son who turned out better than he ever was. The words hit me like a physical blow, 30 years of longing finally given voice. The reception felt different from the rehearsal dinner, the air charged with something I couldn't quite name. Word of what had happened in the chapel had spread through the crowd like ripples across still water, and I found myself at the center of conversations I'd never expected to have. Marianne's father, Harold Holt III, approached me near the bar with the careful steps of a man reconsidering his assumptions. His handshake was firmer this time, his eyes more focused. Mr. Jennings, he said, his patrician accent softened by genuine curiosity, I have to ask, how many students like that young priest have you taught over the years? I don't know, I answered honestly. You never really know which seeds take root until years later, if at all. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I've built shopping centers across 3 states, employed thousands of people, but I've never saved a life with a poem. He paused, swirling his bourbon. Makes a man wonder what he's really building, doesn't it? Across the room, I watched guests gravitating toward conversations about purpose instead of profit, their voices taking on the hushed tones usually reserved for discussing sacred things. A woman I didn't recognize approached, introducing herself as a school board member from Hilton Head. We've been looking for someone to lead our new arts integration program, she said, pressing her card into my hand. After what I heard today, would you consider it? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with notifications I'd been ignoring all day. Social media alerts, messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Someone had recorded Tommy's story in my response, posting it with the caption, "This is what success really looks like." The video had been shared hundreds of times already. Comments poured in from former students, colleagues, strangers, moved by the simple truth that teaching mattered. A message from Sarah Chen, a student I'd taught 5 years ago. Mr. J, you taught me that my immigrant parents' broken English was beautiful. I'm a published poet now because you believed in my voice. Quote. Another from Marcus Williams. Remember when you stayed after school every Tuesday to help me with college essays? I'm a doctor now. Thank you for not giving up on me. Mom appeared at my elbow, her eyes bright with tears she'd been holding back all day. Honey, she whispered, pulling me into a hug that smelled like jasmine and regret. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I was so busy keeping peace that I forgot to fight for what was right. Then Caleb was there, having shed his perfect composure somewhere between the ceremony and now. His bow tie hung loose, his usually perfect hair mussed. I need to say something, he announced, tapping his champagne flute until the room quieted. To my brother, Eli. The crowd turned toward us, expectant. The morning after the wedding found me sitting beneath the old pecan tree in our childhood backyard, reading a letter that had arrived at Mom's house with the sunrise. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, with Tommy's careful handwriting flowing across it like a river of gratitude. Dear Mr. Jennings, it began. I've been trying to write this letter for 7 years, ever since that April afternoon when you saved my life without even knowing it was in danger. Yesterday, watching you find your voice in that chapel, I finally understood what you tried to teach me about the power of words to heal. I'm starting a youth outreach ministry here in Savannah, a place where kids like I was can come when the darkness feels too heavy. I'm calling it Quiet Hands, after that Mary Oliver poem you read me. I wanted you to know that your influence doesn't end in classrooms. It grows, multiplies, becomes something larger than either of us imagined. Thank you for showing me that sometimes the most important work happens in whispers, not shouts. The screen door creaked behind me and Dad emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee and a manila envelope yellowed with age. He moved carefully, like a man learning to navigate unfamiliar emotional territory. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, settling onto the old wooden bench Mom had painted blue every spring for 20 years. We sat in silence for a while, watching mockingbirds chase each other through branches heavy with unripe pecans. The morning air still held night's coolness, promising another scorching Georgia day. "I've been carrying this around for 14 years, Dad said finally, holding out the envelope. "Never knew what to do with it." Quote, inside was a school essay, the paper soft with handling. At the top, in my 15-year-old handwriting, what success means to me. Below it, a grade, A+, and a teacher's note. "Wise beyond your years, Eli. Never lose this perspective." But it was the margin notes that made my breath catch. Dad's handwriting, younger and less certain. He gets it. He understands something I'm still learning. "I kept it," he said quietly, "because it was the first time I realized you might be smarter than your old man." I traced the faded ink with my finger, this artifact of a conversation we'd never had. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Pride, I suppose. Fear that admitting you were right meant admitting I was wrong. He sipped his coffee, steam rising between us like incense. "Spent 30 years in the Army learning that there's only one way to be strong. Took me this long to understand there might be others." We didn't hug. We didn't make grand proclamations about starting over. We just sat beneath that pecan tree, 2 men who'd finally learned to see each other clearly, watching the morning light filter through leaves that had witnessed decades of family silence finally breaking into something that sounded like understanding. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.